Welcome back to part 2 of the Barclay annotation. In part 1, we worked through the opening sections of the William Barclay Situation Ethics Anthology text. And that included the presentation of Fletcher's theory, the key case studies, the wilderness trail, the Bergmeyer case, and Barclay's first 3 objections. In this video, we now cover the final and in some ways most important sections of the text. Barclay's 4th objection, his extended and sophisticated discussion of law and morality, and his conclusion. These sections are less well known than the case studies, but they are deeply important for your essays and for understanding what Barclay is actually arguing. So put the text in front of you, because we're going to annotate closely, not just summarize in general. Let's start by having a look at Barclay's 4th objection, psychological aids. His 4th objection has 2 parts to it. The first challenges some of Fletcher's specific case studies on empirical grounds, arguing that psychological and therapeutic alternatives exist that achieve the loving outcome without breaking moral rules. I need to introduce you to an old American play by Richard Nash, the 1954 Rainmaker, because Barclay alludes to this in his text. And this is where a travelling conman seduces a lonely, plain-spoken rancher's daughter, claiming that it will restore her confidence and hope. Fletcher uses it to illustrate that sometimes an act normally condemned might serve a genuinely loving purpose. So let's get into the text. Barclay's counter here is practical. I've highlighted some specific areas. Let's first have a look at where he says, Fletcher took instances of cures being affected by what the Christian would simply regard as committing adultery. And then he goes on to quote the Rainmaker play in reference to obviously Fletcher using it. Barclay's counter here is practical. He's arguing that Fletcher assumes sexual acts are sometimes the only loving solution to certain psychological conditions. But this assumption is empirically questionable. I've also highlighted the word sublimated, where he says, there is many a man who has had to do without marriage and who has sublimated his sex drive into other achievements. Well, this word sublimation is the redirection of impulses toward other activities, and it's a real psychological phenomenon. And then he goes on to refer to an example of John Wesley. John Wesley, for those who don't know, was a founder of the Methodist Church today, a breakaway, if you like, from the Anglican Church. And his example of John Wesley, where he says, one may speculate whether John Wesley would have been such a dynamic founder of a new church if he had been happily married. This is characteristic of Barclay, using something which is vivid, unexpected, and memorable. And then he goes on to finish this paragraph with the phrase, in point of fact, these cures are far more effective. And this is a confident and pastoral phrase, because Barclay is drawing from decades of ministry in a church, not just a philosophical argument that he's putting forward here. Now, why is this objection interesting? Because it doesn't reject situationist reasoning on philosophical grounds. It challenges a specific situationist conclusion on empirical grounds. Barclay is saying, in the cases that Fletcher describes, love actually points elsewhere than Fletcher thinks. So I want to ask you this question. Is this a refutation of situation ethics, or is it simply a disagreement about what love requires in specific cases? You see, if Barclay is right that psychological alternatives exist and are more effective, a genuine situationist should prefer them, because pragmatism demands that action actually work toward the loving outcome. Let's have a look at Barclay's fourth objection, part 2, the grace of God. The second part of his fourth objection is the most theological, and for many readers, his most provocative. He argues that situation ethics fails to account for the transformative power of divine grace. Let's have a look at this short paragraph I've highlighted. And above all, the situationist is liable to forget quite simply the grace of God, unless Christianity is a total swindle. And this is a distinctively Christian theological objection that sits outside the philosophical ethics that we're looking at. Barclay is arguing that Fletcher's framework is too horizontal. It operates entirely within the human capacity for love and moral reasoning. But Christianity claims that God's grace can transform people, not just advise them. This phrase, unless Christianity is a total swindle, is characteristically Barclay. It's blunt, it's direct, it's slightly combative. And he's staking a theological claim here. If Christianity is true, then human capacity for morality is not fixed at its current level, because grace can elevate it. Now, this objection is important for your essays, because it highlights the theological context in which Barclay is writing. He's not a secular moral philosopher. He's a Christian pastor arguing that Christian ethics must account for Christian theology, including the doctrine that human beings are fallen but redeemable. And I want to ask you, is this a strong objection, do you think, to situation ethics, or does it change the subject? You see, Fletcher is trying to describe what love requires in a world of imperfect human beings. And Barclay's response to this, that God can transform those beings, doesn't directly address the ethical framework. It assumes an additional theological premise. Now, whether that is a strength or weakness of Barclay's objection is the kind of evaluative question your essays will require. Let's have a look at the transition he makes to law. This is Barclay's transitional summary, what he concedes to the situationists before moving on to his extended discussion of law. And it's characteristically generous and it's intellectually honest. Take a look at this short paragraph. The structure here is really important. Barclay concedes 3 genuine contributions of situation ethics. I've highlighted them here. We must indeed be flexible, not with self-righteousness but with sympathy, that we must not be legalists. So we've got flexibility, sympathy towards others, and freedom from legalism. These are not trivial concessions. They represent real moral advances over rigid rule-based thinking. But the phrase he's put here, "We do well still to remember that there are laws which we break at our peril," introduces the final section of the text. Laws are not merely arbitrary constraints. They encode accumulated human wisdom about what kinds of behavior tend to harm people and what kinds of behavior tend to sustain flourishing. Break them and you risk real damage to yourself, to others, to society. Now, this sentence that we've just looked at models what a balanced evaluative conclusion should look like. It doesn't say that situation ethics is entirely wrong. In fact, it says it's partially right, but it's incomplete without the stabilizing function of law. You need to note this structure for your own essays, because the best answers don't dismiss theories wholesale. They identify what is valuable in them before identifying what is missing or dangerous. Let's take a look at the public and private morality Barclay refers to. He now introduces this crucial distinction in moral philosophy between private morality and public morality, and between sin and crime. This distinction was at the centre of major legal and social debates in the 1960s and the 1970s of Britain, following the Wolfenden Report of 1957, which recommended decriminalising homosexuality and certain aspects of prostitution. Now, the Wolfenden Report's principle was that the law should not concern itself with private moral behaviour between consenting adults, unless it causes public harm. And this was a landmark statement of liberal political philosophy with deep implications for the relationship between ethics and law. So let's take a look at this paragraph in your text. I've highlighted this one sentence here. It is always public morals with which the law is concerned and never private morals. Now, the distinction between sin and crime is philosophically important. Sin is a theological category, an offence against God's law or moral law, and crime is a legal category, an offence against the law of the state. Barclay is pointing out that these two categories do not and should not entirely overlap. And this matters for situation ethics because situationists often argue against moral rules precisely by pointing to cases where the law or moral convention seems to produce unjust or loveless outcomes. See, Barclay is suggesting that the relationship between law and morality is far more complex than Fletcher's framework acknowledges. So this section we're looking at connects to wider debates about the role of law in a pluralist society, and Lord Devlin's counter-argument that the suppression of vice is as much the law's business as the suppression of crime represents a view that law and morality cannot be cleanly separated, because the moral fabric of society is what holds it together. Now, where do you stand on the Devlin-Wolfenden debate? Should the law enforce private moral standards or only regulate public behaviour? You see, this connects to contemporary debates about the limits of law in regulating personal choices around things like drugs, sexuality, end-of-life decisions, and many others. Now let's have a look at the three tensions that Barclay addresses. He identifies these three fundamental tensions that are built into the problem of morality and law. The first is the tension between freedom and law. And here you can see I've highlighted, he quotes Fletcher directly. Fletcher writes, "Nothing we do is truly moral unless we are free to do otherwise." And this is a claim that most moral philosophers would accept. Moral responsibility requires freedom, but Barclay raises a profound counter-question. The challenge that Barclay poses is one of the deepest problems in moral philosophy, the question of whether human freedom is real or illusory. And here I've highlighted the things that he lists that forces that shape, the forces that shape us. He has heredity, our environment, our upbringing, our traditions, our temperament, and the accumulated weight of our past decisions, highlighted here. And then his conclusion is striking. Most of us have made ourselves such that we are not free. Freedom to do something is not genuine freedom unless you are also free not to do it. And for many people, the combination of desire, habit, and rationalization means that they are not genuinely free to choose otherwise. Now, this section connects you to the debate about free will and moral responsibility, which runs throughout philosophy, theology, psychology. You see, if Barclay is right that most people are not genuinely free in the way situation ethics requires, free to choose love over desire in every situation, then the theory demands something that most people simply cannot deliver. So I want to ask you, is Barclay's account of human freedom too pessimistic here? Or is he making a realistic observation about moral psychology that the situationist just glosses over? You see, this connects to the tension between idealistic and realistic moral frameworks, and to the debate between Pelagianism and Augustinianism in Christian theology about whether human beings can achieve goodness by their own efforts. Well, let's take a look at the tension between immorality and illegality. The second tension is between what is immoral and what is illegal, and Barclay presents both sides here of the Wolfenden debate. The liberal view that law and private morality should be separate, and Lord Devlin's conservative view that they cannot be. And this is historically significant. The debate sat where the Sexual Offences Act in 1967 had decriminalised homosexuality between consenting adult men in England and Wales. And that was just 4 years before Barclay wrote this. And then you have the Divorce Reform Act in 1969, and that had made divorce significantly easier. And these were live, contested changes in British law, and Barclay's questions reflect the genuine public uncertainty at the time about where the boundaries should lie. So let's have a look at this paragraph here. Let's go to what I've highlighted at the bottom first. The questions that Barclay asks. Are we quite happy about the legalizing of consenting homosexuality? Are we quite happy about the easing of divorce regulations? Now, his questions are deliberately uncomfortable, not because he is homophobic by the standards of his time, but because he's genuinely asking where the logic of the liberal position leads to. If the law has nothing to do with private morality, then the state must treat all consensual private arrangements equivalently. And then you've got Lord Devlin's position that the moral fabric of society is a public good which law has a legitimate interest in protecting. That's a philosophically serious position, and it shouldn't be dismissed just as his mere conservatism. It raises the question of whether there is such a thing as genuinely private morality, or whether all choices have social consequences. Now, this section is the most historically and socially contextual in the extract. You need to understand that Barclay here is writing in a specific moment of rapid social change, and that his questions here reflect the genuine uncertainty of that moment in time. So let me ask you, how does the debate between Wolfenden and Devlin map onto the broader debate between situation ethics and natural law? You see, both pairs involve a dispute about whether there are objective moral standards that should govern behaviour, regardless of individual choice or consent. Now let's turn to the tension between individual and community. His third tension is between these two things. This is the oldest tension in political and moral philosophy. The relationship between personal freedom, the individual, and social obligation, the community. Have a look at this paragraph. What I've highlighted here, the tension between the individual, the community. In the early days of Judaism, there was such solidarity that the individual as an individual had hardly any independent existence. They say that to this day, if you ask a man in a primitive society what his name is, he will begin by telling you not his name, but his tribe. Now, the observation here that he makes about tribal identity, that in some societies a person is going to answer, "What is your name?" by naming their tribe, is an anthropologically accurate and philosophically revealing point. Individualism is a historically and culturally specific value. It's not a universal human orientation. And Barclay's final sentence here, "it can never be right to develop himself at the expense of others," is quietly powerful. It's a critique of radical individualism, and it's an echo of agape, love directed not inward, but outward towards the neighbour. This section shows the tension which connects directly to political philosophy. The debate between liberalism, which prioritizes individual freedom, and communitarianism, which argues that persons are constituted by their social relationships and cannot be understood apart from them. Now, it also connects to situation ethics. Fletcher's framework is highly individualistic. Each person in each situation makes their own loving judgment. And Barclay is questioning here whether a moral framework can be adequate if it doesn't account for the social and communal dimensions of human life. Let's look at then the final conclusion. Barclay's conclusion is characteristically humble and theological. After all these pages of careful analysis, philosophical engagement, and all his pastoral concern, he lands on the same answer Fletcher does: love your neighbour. But he reaches it differently. Let's look at the final paragraph. I've highlighted the phrase delicate balance. We may now welcome to the conclusion that one of the great problems of the present situation is to adjust the delicate balance between freedom and law and the individual and society. Now, this phrase delicate balance is important. Barclay is not offering a formula, he's acknowledging that the relationship between freedom and law, individual and community, must be constantly negotiated. There isn't an algorithm for this. It requires wisdom, experience, and ultimately, love. And his ending, that a man should discover what it means to love his neighbour as himself, returns to that good news, gospel, New Testament Jesus command that is the foundation of Fletcher's entire theory. Barclay ends by agreeing with Fletcher's starting point, while having spent the entire chapter questioning his framework. And this is philosophically honest. Barclay doesn't reject agape. He questions whether most people are capable of applying it without the support of law, tradition, and community. He and Fletcher agree on the destination. They disagree about whether human beings can reach it simply without a map. Now take note, this final conclusion is important for your essays because it shows that the debate between Barclay and Fletcher is not between love and rules. It's between two different accounts of human nature and what human beings need in order to live well. So let's finish with asking you this question. Is Barclay's conclusion satisfying? You see, he's identified three genuine tensions here: freedom and law, immorality and illegality, individual and community. And his proposed solution from it all is love. But that's exactly what Fletcher also proposed. So the question is not whether love is the answer, but how a society organizes itself to help people love well. And Barclay's answer is through law, tradition, and the grace of God. And Fletcher's answer is through the free exercise of situational judgment. And these two answers represent two genuinely different visions of moral life.